This is Kang here, and this is part 2 of 4 video lectures on deductive arguments. Today we will cover 2 inference patterns known as modus ponens and modus tollens. So first, let's do a quick recap of what we did last video lecture. The upshot of the last lecture was the distinction between valid argument and sound argument. A valid argument is one where the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. In other words, it's not possible for the premises to be true and yet the conclusion false. On the other hand, a sound argument is a valid argument where the premises are all true. Now this is important because what this means is that all sound arguments are also valid arguments, but not the other way around. Not every valid argument is a sound argument, and that's because valid arguments can have false premises. For example, the moon argument that we looked at last time is one where the premises are false. So not every valid argument is going to be sound, but all sound arguments are valid by definition. Now, our aim in this class is trying to provide sound arguments, but first we need to learn how to provide valid arguments. And in the last video lecture, I have said that one way to make sure that our argument is valid is to make it fit an inference pattern. And an inference pattern is a basic rule that tells you when a sentence or conclusion follows logically from a set of premises. We will learn 6 different inference patterns in this course, starting with 2 very, very important ones, modus ponens and modus tollens. The first thing to notice about these inference patterns is that they are formal, meaning that there is a specific form behind each individual inference pattern. For instance, here is a basic form of a modus ponens argument. Premise 1, if P, then Q. Premise 2, P. Conclusion, therefore Q. So this is an example of a form of a modus ponens argument. All modus ponens arguments will have this form. Now, to give it a concrete example of a modus ponens argument, we'll just replace the P and the Q with English sentences. So let me illustrate this with an example. Here's the argument. Premise 1. If Thom Yorke performs at Coachella, then at least one member of Radiohead performs at Coachella. Premise 2. Thom Yorke performs at Coachella. Conclusion. So at least one member of Radiohead performs at Coachella. Now this is a valid argument, and it's also a sound argument because we know that the premises are true. Premise 1 is true because Thom Yorke is indeed a member of the band Radiohead, and premise 2 is also true because Thom Yorke will perform at Coachella this year. So this is a valid argument. The conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. And if we look at the form of the argument, we'll notice that the P's and Q's are substituted for English sentences. For instance, P is substituted for Thom Yorke performs at Coachella, and Q is substituted for at least one member of Radiohead performs at Coachella. Here's a different example. Substitute P for Justin Bieber performs at Coachella, and Q for at least one member of Radiohead performs at Coachella. So if we sub in these English sentences for P and Q, we'll have the following argument. Now, this argument is also valid. It's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. For instance, if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true as well. However, in this case, this argument is valid but not sound, because one of its premises is false. For instance, premise 1 is false because Justin Bieber is not a member of Radiohead. So if Justin Bieber performs at Coachella, that doesn't mean that at least one member of Radiohead performs at Coachella. And this brings me to a very important point. Modus ponens, like other inference patterns that we'll learn in this course, is supposed to be formal, meaning that all arguments that fit any of the inference patterns that we'll learn will be valid just by virtue of its form. And now let me introduce you to a distinction between form and content. To illustrate this distinction, we'll look at this argument. Premise 1, if this dish has meat in it, then it's vegan. Premise 2, this dish has meat in it. Conclusion, so it is vegan. Now the content of these sentences are pretty meaningless or nonsensical. Anyone who understands the meaning of the word vegan will know that premise 1 is false. However, the argument actually fits the form of a modus ponens, and so this argument will be valid just by virtue of its form. It's not possible for the premises to be true and yet the conclusion false. And this brings me to a next important point. All the inference patterns you will learn in this class will ensure that your argument is valid, but they do not ensure that the argument is sound. An inference pattern is supposed to be formal, and we had just looked at the form of the modus ponens. Premise 1, if P then Q. Premise 2, P, conclusion, therefore Q. The next inference pattern we'll look at has a slightly different form. Modus tollens has the following form. If P then Q, not Q, so not P. So when I say not Q, basically it means something like it's not the case that Q, or that it's false that Q. Now let me give you an example of a modus tollens argument. Premise 1, if God exists, then the world is good. Premise 2, it's not true that the world is good. Conclusion, so it's not true that God exists. If you have taken a class on philosophy of religion, you may be familiar with this kind of argument. It's basically an argument that appeals to what we call the problem of evil. God is said to be this all-powerful and all-loving, all-good entity or being. Why would he create a world that has some evil in it? It's true that the world contains some amount of suffering and evil. The basic line of thought is, if God exists, then there should be no evil in the world. However, there is evil in the world, so God does not exist. So this argument is again valid by virtue of its form. Its soundness, though, is still up to debate. If you disagree with the conclusion of this argument, what you have to do is to engage with the premises. You have to give the readers reasons to think that one of the premises is false. And here I'm going to be offering general advice on how to engage with an argument. When somebody gives you a valid argument and you disagree with the conclusion of the argument, you have to point out the flaws in the argument. You have to be able to tell the reader or your interlocutor which premise you think is false, and you have to provide reasons for why you think a particular premise is false. And when it comes to this particular argument, other philosophers have tried to reject premise 1. They have tried to show that even though God exists and is perfectly good, there can still be evil in the world. Okay, I'll end that little digression over there and focus on the main issue. In this particular argument, we have substituted the symbol P for the English sentence God exists, and the word or the symbol Q for the world is good. And when we sub in these English sentences for those symbols, we get the argument that we just looked at. And that argument fits exactly the form of a modus tollens. The best way to memorize these inference patterns is to come up with your own arguments, with your own modus ponens and your own modus tollens. I encourage you guys to come up with your own examples of these inference patterns and try to be creative and have fun with them. And that's all for this video lecture. In the next one, I will teach you guys 2 more inference patterns: predicate instantiation and disjunctive syllogism. In the meantime, stay healthy and thank you for listening.